Hi everyone, I'm David Aragona, and this is the March 17th edition of Horses to Watch, where we carefully analyze trips, looking for horses that might have encountered adversity in their prior starts and might be worth following when they run back in the future. Well, that dreaded rail bias was back last week at Aqueduct. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we saw varying degrees of that rail bias be in evidence on all 3 days. We got a bit of a respite from it 2 weeks ago at Aqueduct when it was Gotham week. We didn't see too much evidence of a rail bias those 3 days, but we saw plenty of rail bias days back in February, an entire 3-day weekend in the middle of the month, and plenty of other days scattered around there. And it was certainly back this past week on March 12th, 13th, and 14th, Friday through Sunday. We're going to talk about one race from each of those days and 3 different types of races: a starter allowance from Friday, and a maiden race from Saturday, and an allowance race on Sunday. Let's begin with that race from last Friday's card, March 12th. It's a starter allowance 50,000 going the 1-turn mile. We're going to focus on 2 horses in this race, the number 4 Grit and Glory and the number 5 Dust Devil. Let's break these horses from the gate. It's a relatively small field, and you see that the 2 horses we want to focus on are breaking towards the outside. The number 4 Grit and Glory actually breaks very sharply and has an opportunity to get to the front end and to get to the rail. And you see very briefly there, his rider, Eric Cancel, is trying to hustle him into a forward position, trying to take advantage of that advantageous rail spot on this biased racetrack. But the 1A Democratic Values is a little bit faster. And watch what happens to the number 4 Grit and Glory right here. Cancel tries to rein him in and get him into that position, stalking in behind. But the leader is slowing down the pace so much that the other horses rush up all around him. And he's basically surrounded by horses now, 3 wide moving down the backstretch. And that's certainly not the position that I think Eric Cancel wanted to get into. And it's really not the position you want to be in on any racetrack, but it's certainly not a biased racetrack off the rail and in an awkward position behind and between horses. Meanwhile, the number 5 Dust Devil has gotten to a much better position from a tactical standpoint because he's close to the pace. But do note, he's off the rail racing 2 to 3 wide all the way down the backstretch and around the far turn. And no surprise that the horse is going to be the eventual winner of this race is the number 1A Democratic Values, who got to that perfect position towards the front end and on the inside. Now, notice the pace of this race. The half mile goes up in almost 49 seconds. So immediately that gives the advantage to the horses towards the front end. The number 5 Dust Devil does have that tactical advantage over Grit and Glory, who's now trying to make up ground from the back of the pack. But watch as they come through the stretch here. Dust Devil looks like he has a lot more horse left than the number 1A Democratic Values to his inside. He came under a ride much later than the Democratic Values did, but because Democratic Values has that coveted position down on the rail, he never relinquishes the lead and is able to battle back inside of his rival and just barely hold on to win by a nose over Dust Devil, who looked like he could go by at any time at the quarter pole. Meanwhile, Grit and Glory, all things considered for his trip, he finishes up pretty well to be 4th here. Doesn't really pass anybody in the lane, but he's making up some ground to lose by just 2.5 lengths at the end of this race. Thought it was a good effort from Grit and Glory, given that the trip didn't really work out in the first 1/8 of a mile of this race. And just to talk about the trajectory of these 2 horses coming in and out of this race, Dust Devil has now been against rail biases in 2 consecutive starts. He actually had a much worse trip 2 back prior to this when he was wide and against a pace situation. Grit and Glory, meanwhile, he was coming off a career best performance into this race where he had ridden a rail bias. And while it might seem like he regressed a great deal in this race, I think the difference in trips between his race 2 back and this last time had a lot to do with that perceived regression. So Grit and Glory is in pretty good form overall. I just think he's not quite as good as his effort 2 back, but he's also not as bad as his performance in this race. So I think he'll find a happy medium in an upcoming start. Moving on to a race from Saturday's card, and I should say, as we talk about these races from Friday and Saturday, I think the rail bias that we saw this past week was the strongest on Friday and Saturday. I'm not really sure which day was stronger. A little bit less pronounced on Sunday, so we'll get to that in a little bit, but I think it was really hard to make up ground on the outside on both these Friday and Saturday cards. The Saturday race that I want to look at, March 13th, that's race 6. It's a maiden claiming event, $25,000 tag going 6 furlongs. We're going to focus on a first-time starter in this race. Let's break him from the gate, and the horse that I want to focus on here is the number 4, Bar 14. He is a first-time starter for trainer Bruce Brown, being ridden by Kendrick Carmouche, which had to be considered a good sign because he doesn't ride that much for the Bruce Brown ground barn, certainly not on a lot of first-time starters. And you see Bar 14 broke at the back of the pack, was immediately behind the field, but quickly rushed up in the opening furlong to get a forward position, suggesting that this horse does have plenty of tactical speed, just wasn't able to get to the front here because of that tardy break. But as they move down the backstretch, he is very eager under Kendrick, trying to rush up on the outside, but he's moving 4 wide into the far turn. And as I said, especially on Saturday's card, that's not where you wanted to be. There was a heavy favorite in this race, the number 5, Devious Mo, who you see here. He's 3-5, and he was too wide early, but he gets to the rail by the time they get to about the 3/8 pole on the far turn, and he's going to ride the rail the rest of the way. And when you've got a heavy favorite that's riding a bias, that's basically a recipe for an exaggerated winning performance, and that's what we're going to see from Devious Mo, who just runs off the screen here. But Bar 14, the number 4, who's 3 wide on the far turn, now 2 wide at the top of the stretch. He's going to angle out a little bit here. He's finishing up pretty well, despite the fact that he's never on the rail in this race. And he's obviously no match for Devious Mo, but he never quits running after that horse. Is going to open up a significant margin on the rest of the field. And this was a very fast race for the level for just $25,000 maiden claimers. The winner got a buyer in the high 70s. Bar 14 and finishing second got a 57 buyer. That's a really strong number for a horse that debuted for a $25,000 tag, and especially for a horse that was against the bias the entire way. So this horse has some ability. He was 8-1 first time out. That was actually taking some money into the face of that 3-5 favorite. So I think we could see a better effort from Bar 14 next time. And I also wouldn't be surprised if we eventually see this horse get on turf, because while the sire Gemologist is not much of a turf influence, the dam of this horse was a pretty good turf performer. I think she was a grade 3 winner on that surface, so we'll see which surface this horse eventually prefers, but he did show some ability in this dirt sprint debut. One more race to talk about, moving on to the final day of racing from last week at Aqueduct. That was Sunday's card. As I said, the rail bias perhaps not quite as pronounced on this day, though there were some other things going on with the racetrack on Sunday. There were some very high winds in the New York City area that might have been messing with some of the races a little bit, certainly messing with the times of the races. We saw the times and fractions be all over the place throughout the day. So it's just a really tough day to make pace figures and final time speed figures. So take those with a grain of salt moving forward. But I do want to talk about a race that came up very fast from Sunday's card. It's race 5, an allowance not winners of one other than going the 1.125 distance around 2 turns. Let's break these horses from the gate. And I'm actually going to focus on the eventual winner of this race, the number 6, Mystic Knight. Breaking Roan from the outside, he breaks pretty sharply, is briefly vying for the lead with the number 4 Yankee Division, who's the speed of this race, but that one is sent very aggressively to the front end, whereas the number 6 Mystic Knight is taken in hand, not aggressively, but just allowed to settle in mid-pack here, and he's going to get into a position about in 4th place, but about 2 to 3 wide around the clubhouse turn, and we were still seeing evidence of a rail bias on Sunday, so the horse that was getting the best trip in this race is that leader, the number 4 Yankee Division, who was hustled to the front end, and in addition to being the lone leader in this race, Yankee Division was also the lone front runner, so he was getting the perfect kind of trip for him, and we saw what Yankee Division could do when he got the same kind of trip in his prior start on the rail, riding a rail-biased racetrack 2-back. He opened up and won by over 7 lengths with a 99 buyer. So he was going to be pretty formidable getting the same kind of trip here, even going the 1.125 distance. Now, Mystic Knight on the backstretch here, you can't really see it on the pan shot, but he does briefly get over to the rail for about a couple of furlongs, drafting in behind that horse who's currently in 3rd place as they move down the backstretch. But only being on the rail for about 2 furlongs of a 9-furlong race is not that significant, in my opinion. And as they come around the far turn here, you see that he's going to get angled off the inside and start to launch a rally coming around horses on the far turn. And throughout these 3 days from last week at Aqueduct, we didn't see too many horses successfully making this move, commencing a rally wide on the turn and continuing to make up ground into the stretch. But that's exactly what Mystic Knight does. And Yankee Division, he comes into the lane on a loose lead, having had everything his own way. Most horses over this 3-day period would run off to a clear victory based on that kind of trip. But Mystic Knight has a thing or two to say about that, because look at him just relentlessly coming down the center of the track here. Nobody else is making up ground from the back of the pack, and he is just continuing to pick up momentum on the outside of Yankee Division, who's drawing away from the rest of the field. But still, Mystic Knight reels him in and goes on to a pretty impressive 2-length victory here. This is a big, lanky, strong son of Into Mischief who just seems like he relishes the 1.125 distance. This was his first time around 2 turns, and he appeared to love going that added ground. Even though he's by Into Mischief, who sometimes gets a reputation as being a sire of sprinter milers, he's gotten many more horses in his past couple of crops that can go longer distances, and Mystic Knight really has a pedigree, especially on the bottom side, to go longer. His dam's actually a half-sister to Shared Account, who was winner of the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf a number of years ago. So some real foundation of stamina breeding on the bottom side for Mystic Knight. And this is a 4-year-old who's lightly raced. He's a gelding who was just making his first start around 2 turns here. He got a very high 99 buyer for this race. But again, I would say take that number with a bit of a grain of salt because of the difficulty of making speed figures on Sunday. But Yankee Division, who he beat, is a good horse. And I think Mystic Knight has a future in stakes races down the line going these longer distances. So those are all the horses to watch for this week. Remember that if you want to follow these horses in the future, you can add them to your horse watch on DRF.com. Just go to horse watch on the website and add these horses to your watch mail. You'll get updates when they run back or have workouts in the future, and you can follow these horses in their subsequent starts. So those are all the horses to watch for this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back with another episode of Horses to Watch on Wednesday.